Welcome to Living Word Ministries with our director and Bible teacher, Debbie Blank. Debbie's passion is for you to understand and apply God's truths to your life. Now let's listen and enjoy teaching from the Word of God with Debbie Blank.
Hellenism was really a very loose culture of having fun and doing what you want to do. And it was this culture that would be perpetrated upon Israel that we're going to see as we move along. Daniel 8:8 now says, "Then the male goat magnified himself exceedingly, but as soon as he was mighty, the large horn was broken, and in its place there came up 4 conspicuous horns towards the 4 winds of the heavens." So obviously, once Alexander was magnificent, he died. It says here he's broken, and 4 other horns came up in his place. Now it also says they not only came up, but towards the 4 winds of heaven. So in order to understand that, we look at verse 22. Verse 22 explains who these 4 horns are. When it says the broken horn and the 4 horns that arose in its place represent 4 what? Kingdoms which will arise from his nation, Alexander's, although not with his power. Again, we discussed this last week. This is another reason why I see this last week's chapter as being these same 2 kingdoms along with the other 2 kingdoms, because God continually uses the same kingdoms over and over to teach us something. This is the division of the Grecian Empire after Alexander's death. Now you will see yellow over in the left, which is the area of Greece. Cassandra took that over, the general of his army. Lysimaeus took over Asia Minor, which is now Turkey. The Ptolemies took over the purple part down in Egypt and south of Egypt. And the Seleucids have the orange section in there, the largest section of all of them. If you go back to chapter 8, it says that these 4 conspicuous horns came up towards the 4 winds of heaven, meaning the 4 areas of the earth. And what areas do you see? North, south, east, west. They took over that whole empire that Alexander had left. What's important on this map are the Seleucids and the Ptolemies, the orange and the purple. Get that in your mind, because when we come to chapter 11 especially, we're going to talk about the kings of the north, the orange, the kings of the south, the purple. The Seleucids against the Ptolemies. We're going to see battles that have already taken place that are described in detail in chapter 11. Right now, at least with this particular map, who controls the land of Israel? The Ptolemies. But if the Seleucids want to battle the Ptolemies, where do they have to go through? Israel. So every time they had one of these kings of the north, kings of the south battles, they went right through Israel to fight each other. Israel was right in the middle of that. That's a thought for chapter 11 when we get there. The important thing for tonight for us to understand is the Seleucid Empire. Because as we move on, one of the kings out of this Seleucid Empire is the person that we're going to be discussing for the rest of this class tonight. Alexander did know, because when he went in to conquer Israel, this is, I won't say it's history, it's, they believe it happened. It's written in the Jewish sages that when Alexander went in to conquer Israel, the rabbis showed him this passage in Daniel and said that God had prophesied that he would come into the land, please spare them, and he did. So he did know that, because when he went in to conquer it, they told him. Otherwise, he would not have known this. Remember, this was written in 551 BC. Alexander didn't come on the scene for a long time later. But people didn't have access to a Bible, so they couldn't just walk up to Alexander. He had to be in Israel, and they had to show it to him. That's a tradition that is told us. Historically, we don't have proof of that. But it makes sense, because he was conquering everything else and destroying a lot of places, and he didn't destroy Israel. Good comment. Any other comments or anything? Let's move on to Daniel. Now chapter 8, verse 9. Out of one of them, one of what? One of the 4 horns, came forth a rather small horn, which grew exceedingly great toward the south, and toward the east, and towards the beautiful land. Well, we look back on the map, and we see, well, we don't know this yet, but we'll find out later, that the Seleucids were trying to go to the south. And in trying to go to the south, then, they had to go to what land? The beautiful land, which is another name for Israel. It grew up, this little horn grew up to the host of heaven, and caused some of the host and some of the stars to fall to earth, and it trampled them down. Now here's where we run into a little confusion. Who do you think the host of heaven are? Who do you think the stars are? The what? Other kingdoms, okay.
The host might be the angels.
Okay, generally speaking, when we think of host of heaven, we think of angels. Okay? Does a human have any ability to bring the angels down to earth? No, they really don't. Unless it's a spiritual battle and the host of heaven, the angels, the demons actually, I should say, not angels. They're angels, but they're the bad angels. If it was a spiritual battle, which we'll see in chapter 10, then they could get involved. They could get it. So, is it angels? Could be. Angels are considered hosts of heaven. Satan was the number one host of heaven as far as a bad angel goes.
And he was also the star, the bright morning star.
Right. The bright morning star. Well, she said when it grew up to the host of heaven and caused some of the hosts and some of the stars to fall to the earth. Let's look at Genesis 22:17 and see if we can come up with an answer to this and to what you just asked. In Genesis 22:17, it says, "Indeed, I will greatly..." This, just to give you a context here, this is the chapter where Abraham sacrificed Isaac. This is after the sacrifice did not take place, after the angel stopped him. God said, "Indeed, I will greatly bless you, Abraham, and I will greatly multiply your seed as the" what? "Stars of the heavens, and as the sand which is on the seashore." So he equates Israel with the stars of the heavens, which is that same idea. Let's look also at Genesis 37:9, just to double check this, because if we can't tell something from the text, what we always want to do is cross-reference it to other texts to see what they say, both within the same book and outside of it. In Genesis 37:9 it says, Now he still had another dream and related it to his brothers. We're talking about Joseph here. And said, "Lo, I have had still another dream, and behold, the sun and the moon and the 11 stars were bowing down to me." So there again, what's the idea of that dream that Joseph had when he said the sun and the moon and the 11 stars? His mother, his father, and his 11 brothers. In other words, all of Israel was bowing down to Joseph. That ended up happening. So again, the Jews are related to as the stars of heaven here. So the understanding of this passage is he grew up, he gained power, and went up against the Jews. That's what he did. And we know historically he did that. We're going to find out tonight exactly what he did do when he went up against the Jews. And it says here at the end of verse 10, "And he trampled them down." And he did. Verse 11 says, and when it talks about it's talking about this little horn, and we know this is talking about this one particular king. "It even magnified itself to be equal with the commander of the host." Oh, when you think of the commander of the host, what do you think of? Okay, we'll leave that there. God. Yeah, we think of God. So he magnified himself to be equal with God. And he removed the regular sacrifices from God, from him, and the place of God's sanctuary was thrown down. At that time, if you know the history of Israel, At that time, where was the sanctuary of the Jews? Where God dwelt with his people? It was the Ark of the Covenant specifically, which was in what? The temple. It was inside the temple. The temple was the place where God dwelt with the Jews, and that was on what particular site? The Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is in Israel right now, though there's 2 mosques on there and no temple. And in, obviously I just think I said it. What city is it in? Jerusalem. All right. Okay. So, and what happened? In this whole temple complex, what was one of the things they did at least twice a day? They offered sacrifices. So this man, it says, is going to make himself equal with God. He's going to remove the normal Jewish sacrifices, and he's going to throw down, either destroy or try to destroy spiritually, the sanctuary or the temple where God resides. That's what verse 11 says. And on account of transgressions, the host will be given over to the horn. See, this gives us a better understanding of that this host is the Jews. On account of transgressions, the host will be given over to him. So if the host are the Jews, what does it mean on account of transgressions? Because of their sin. Because of their transgressions against God, God gave them over to the hand of this despicable horn. And it goes on to say, and on account of transgressions, the host will be given over to the horn along with the regular sacrifice, and it will fling, this person, will fling truth to the ground and perform its will and prosper. So because of the sins of the Jews, God is going to give them over to an enemy. Does that sound right? I mean, why would God give someone that he loves over to their enemy? To what? To get their attention. We saw it at the beginning of the book of Daniel. He did that because the Jews had transgressed against God. So he gave them, sold them into Babylon, so to speak. And now he's going to do the same thing several hundred years later to this little horn. Turn with me for a moment into Deuteronomy. This is a passage we use a lot, but it's one that's very important in chapter 28. Very important to understand. Deuteronomy is what's called the second law. Because when the Jews wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, everybody died. Before they went into the promised land, it was a whole new generation. They had to be given the same law that the Jews had been given at Mount Sinai. So when Moses gave them the book of Deuteronomy, he was basically reiterating everything they'd had in the previous law that was given to them. But this is for a new generation. So he tells them in Deuteronomy 28, verse 1, "It shall be, if you will diligently obey the Lord your God, being careful to do all of his commandments which I have commanded you today, the Lord your God will set you high above all the nations of the earth. And all these blessings shall come upon you and overtake you if you will obey the Lord your God." Then he lists several verses of the blessings that God's going to give the Jews if they will obey him. Verse 15, "But it shall come about, if you will not obey the Lord your God, to observe to do all the commandments and his statutes with which I charge you today, that all these curses shall come upon you and overtake you." And there's a whole bunch more curses listed here than there are blessings. Not only that, but probably the most interesting curse to me, because it's still going today, is verse 37 of Deuteronomy 28, that says, "You shall become a horror, a proverb, and a taunt among all the peoples where the Lord will drive you." That's why we have anti-Semitism today. It's a consequence of the Jews' sin down through their generations. It's a consequence of them turning away from their God and missing their Messiah. That's what we're seeing today. Does that give us an excuse to treat them poorly? No, it does not, because God's word never changes. He says in Genesis 12:3, "I will bless those who bless you, Abraham Jews. I will curse those who curse you." And that promise is still valid today. So here we have a whole explanation of what's going to happen to the Jewish people by this Seleucid king that will come up in the Grecian Empire. Now let me give you let's see what I have here next. Okay. Let me continue on, and then I'll further explain this. In verses 23 to 25, it further explains what Daniel has been told here in these verses. What's explained is that in the latter period of their rule, whose rule? The Grecian rule. Okay. The latter period of the Grecian rule. Even though the Seleucids and this particular little horn happens to be the king of the Seleucids, they're still all part of the Grecian Empire. In the latter part of their rule, when the transgressors have run their course, in other words, you've sinned against God, a king will arise, and he's going to be insolent and skilled in intrigue. His power will be mighty, but not by his own power. He will destroy to an extraordinary degree and prosper and perform his will. He will destroy mighty men and the holy people. Who are the holy people? Jews. Mighty men are all the people of the Ptolemies that he continues to fight against. And through his shrewdness, he will cause deceit to succeed by his influence. He will magnify himself in his heart. He will destroy many while they are at ease. He will even oppose the prince of princes, but he will be broken without human agency. Who is the prince of princes? God. Jesus Christ is who we think of as the prince of princes. He's going to oppose God, but he's going to be broken without human agency. It's believed that the person we're going to talk about tonight died of insanity. Either that or bowel disease, they're not sure which, but either one, it wasn't because he was killed by anyone else. That's how he died. Now, let's get back to this. This is very important because in verse 23 it says, in the latter period of their rule. Clearly the timing here, talking about this particular small horn, is when? We've already talked about it. It's during the Grecian rule. Is this talking about the Antichrist? It's not talking about the Antichrist here contextually because it says it's the latter part of the Greeks' rule. Now, what we're going to see here and what we're going to see later in chapter 11 is this man epitomizes the Antichrist. Now, there are people that will say to me, do you think so-and-so is the Antichrist? And my response is, I don't know. He epitomizes him in many ways, but I don't know if he is him. Well, that's the way we are here. This person is going to epitomize the Antichrist because what he's going to do here is going to be mentioned later by Jesus as something that happens with the Antichrist. So he epitomizes him. He's like the Antichrist. But contextually, this is a man that was a king during the Grecian Empire. Okay, got that? Now, let's look at this. This is the man we're talking about. Antiochus Epiphanes, Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who ruled from 175 to 164 BC. Why do we know this? Because history proves it to us. Not just history in general, but you have just an example here that I'll explain to you. But up at the top, there's a quote here by Josephus, who wrote the history of the Jews. He was alive during the time of the Roman conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD, but he also wrote about the history of the Jews. And what he says about Antiochus Epiphanes, I call him Antiochus Epiphanes. Most people call him Antiochus, and that's probably right. But old habits die hard. He said, and indeed it came to pass that our nation suffered these things under Antiochus Epiphanes according to Daniel's vision and what he wrote years before they came to pass. So even a secular Jew named Josephus authenticated that what had happened in Israel almost 200 years before his time was the fulfillment of Daniel's prophecy. We're going to see historically that it is. This is just an example of a shaggy goat, and you have four horns: Ptolemy, Cassandra, Lysimaeus there, and the Seleucids here on the top right with that little horn coming up, Antiochus Epiphanes. What this does is explains a little bit about him, that he came out of one of them, which he did. He came out of the Seleucid Empire, and he ruled that empire from 175 to 164. It says down here that, well, let's go up here at the top. Antiochus IV came to power in the latter time of their kingdom, which he did, 7 years before the demise of the Grecian Empire. It says on the left that he only sought to enlarge his territories towards the south, the east, and the pleasant land, or the beautiful land. He didn't go way far west. He stayed in his area, but he kept going south through Israel. Finally, it tells us down here, Antiochus Epiphanes outlawed the sanctuary services in 171 BC. 2,300 days later, on the well-established date of December 25th, 165 BC, the temple was cleansed and its service was restored. Now, I'm going to explain that in a minute. As a matter of fact, I think, before I do that, I think I'll explain it to you now. Let's not only go to history, but let's go to the Apocrypha. What's the Apocrypha? Okay, they're extra biblical books. The Catholic religion believes that these books are part of the original Bible. There's 10 extra books, I think, and several extra writings. The Protestant church has not accepted them as being biblical. But they are historical. One way or another, they're historical. One of the books is called First Maccabees. And First Maccabees details exactly about Antiochus Epiphanes and what he did to the beautiful land. So I'm going to read you some of these because you're going to find them very interesting, especially after we've read what Daniel said would happen. It said Alexander had reigned 12 years when he died. Each of his commanders took over the kingdom assigned to him. That happened. From these rulers, there came a sinful offshoot, Antiochus the Illustrious, son of King Antiochus. It goes on to say that in those days there were unfaithful Jews who tried to persuade many, saying, "Let us have an understanding with the pagans around us, for since we left them, many evils have befallen us." So in other words, what the Jews were saying is, let's follow that government because we can't rule ourselves. What does that sound like? Sounds like us. Whenever anything happens, the government will take care of us. And that's what these pagans were saying. As a matter of fact, it was worse than that. This doesn't say that, but history does. That the Jews went to Antiochus and said, we want Jason, the brother of the high priest, to be high priest in his place because he's a Hellenist. His brother isn't. Jason's a Hellenist, and he'll move the Jews towards following Hellenism, which is what you want, O king. And the king says, sure, do it. It goes on to say, they went to the king who gave them permission to follow pagan practices. They built a gymnasium in Jerusalem in the pagan manner, hid the fact that they were circumcised. How do you hide that? First of all, when men go to a gymnasium, what do they dress in? Nothing. So how do you hide the fact that you're circumcised? They literally tried. They would put things around their private parts to make it look like they were not circumcised. They did not want to be recognized as Jews. These are Hellenistic Jews at this time. They want the world system in their country instead of the godly system. Have we ever seen that in Israel before? Do you remember after the time, what were you going to say, Rob?
The golden calf.
The golden calf. That's a great example. And then at the time of after the judges, they went to Samuel and said, we want to be like all the other nations. We want a king. And Samuel said, well, if you want a king, this is what he's going to do to you. He's going to, all these bad things are going to happen. You're going to pay taxes. You're going to have to give your animals, and your kids are going to be his slaves, and all these things are going to happen. And they said, we want a king because we want to be like all the other nations. That's what we see here. They wanted to be like them. It says that they abandoned God's covenant. They joined the heathens in doing evil. It talks then about him invading Egypt here, but I'm going to bypass that. It said at one point after he invaded Egypt, it said he marched into Jerusalem with a great army and arrogantly entered the temple sanctuary where he took away the golden altar, the candlestick of light, and all the vessels. He stripped the temple of everything of value. When he had taken everything of value, he departed to his own country, but he slaughtered many men along the way and bragged about it. 2 years later, the king sent the chief collectors of his taxes to the city of Judah. He came to Jerusalem with a large force. He deceived the people by speaking of peace, and they believed him. Does that sound familiar? It's funny because in the book of Jeremiah in the Old Testament and in the book of Thessalonians in the New Testament, both places it says the Jews are going to say peace, peace, but there is no peace. We're seeing that today. It says, but suddenly, after he said peace, and they believed him, suddenly he attacked the city and killed many Israelites. Now remember that piece about peace, because I want to hit it to you in the New Testament in a minute. King Antiochus issued a proclamation that all his kingdom should be one people, giving up all their own religions. Many Israelites chose his religion, sacrificing to idols and ignoring the Sabbath. He ordered the people to follow the foreign customs of the kingdom, banning holocausts and sacrifices and the acts performed in God's temple. He prohibited them keeping the Sabbath and celebrating religious holidays. He ordered altars, temples, and idols to be built. He put pig's flesh and unclean beasts on the altars to be sacrificed. Now, pig's flesh and unclean beasts can't get any worse than that. They're never to be sacrificed. Children were not to be circumcised. They were to practice all the kinds of immorality and evil so that they would forget the observance of God's law. Anyone who failed to obey the king's command was to be put to death. This is Antiochus Epiphanes. This is who this is talking about in Daniel chapter 8. Here's the bad part, if you don't think that was bad enough. On the 15th day of Chislev in the 145th year, see, I love the Bible and I love the historical parts because they tell us exactly when these things are happening so that they match up with the Bible. King Antiochus set up the terrible idol of Baal over the very altar of God. And similar altars were built throughout the cities of Judah. They burned incense and sacrificed at the door of the houses and in the streets. They tore up and burned the books containing the law of God. By the king's decree, they put to death anyone found with the books of the covenant or observing the laws of God.
Thank you for joining us today on Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank. To contact Debbie Blank, you may do so at livingwordministry.org. That's www.livingwordministry.org. Please tune in each week at the same time for Living Word Ministries with Debbie Blank.